Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by From Manager to Remarkable Leader, Kevin's flagship workshop based on his proven leadership model. Learn more at remarkablepodcast.com/manager. And now here's your host, Kevin.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you happen to be. I'm glad to be with you today. Live, I'm Kevin Eikenberry, and it is another episode of Live with Kevin and the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You know, change is everywhere and seemingly coming faster than ever. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a playbook that could help us lead through explosive change, make sense of explosive change, and make a difference in that scenario? Well, if you're thinking that sounds good, you are absolutely in the right place. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You can get all future live episodes and therefore interact with us and see them sooner by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkable.com/LinkedIn to do that. And while you're here now, if you're here with us live, imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee. Please share your questions and comments and ideas, and we'll make for a better conversation now and eventually for all of the podcast listeners later. Today's episode is brought to you by the Long Distance Teammate. If you work remotely and want to be more effective, productive, more engaged, and more connected, this book will help you get there, because there's a big difference between working from home and being an engaged and effective remote teammate. You can learn more and get your copy of the book at longdistanceteammate.com. And now let me, without any further ado, introduce you to our guest. His name is Henry DeCio. Let me introduce Henry to you, and then we will dive in. All right. So Henry is known as the Global Ambassador for Changemakers. As a leadership advisor, campaign strategist, and keynote speaker, he has served as an executive both in startups and large, complex organizations. As the 2008 COO of Barack Obama's presidential campaign, and then serving as the deputy assistant to the president in the White House, he became intimately acquainted with a new emerging pattern of societal change. He has engaged with the world's leading social and business entrepreneurs and has brought the powerful framework for a new leadership and team of teams organization described in his new book, Changemaker Playbook. See, I promised you a playbook to teams of all sorts all over the world. He holds a master's degree in public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School, and he lives in Arlington, Virginia. He's our guest today. Henry, welcome. I'm so glad to have you. So glad to have you as a part of the show today. Glad you're here.
Thank you, Kevin.
So enough of me talking. Let's get you talking. And I want you to just tell us a little bit about your journey. I mean, not everybody wakes up as a kid and says, hey, I'd like to work in the White House, or any of the other things that you've done in your career. Tell us a little bit about your journey, how you ended up, just a little bit about your path.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up near Sequoia National Park in a very small town. So when that White House came onto my TV screen, on that black and white TV when I was a kid, we had just, the cable stopped at our doorstep. So we only had 3 channels for a long time. And so,
me too.
Okay, so you know this. And so, being a kid growing up rural in California, sort of disconnected, it felt a bit like an island living in these foothills. But I do remember it, it was right at the time when my first reality TV show would come on in the summer. So you come in from the hot sun and from playing outside, and there was this show called The Watergate Hearings was coming on TV. So that's what I did in the middle of the day for a few hours every day for a few weeks there. And I became sort of, I guess I was maybe 11, 12. I became quite fascinated with the whole world of Washington politics. And I remember seeing that White House in the evening news and things. And I had always think, I think I'm going to be there someday. It wasn't like a goal or a drive or anything like that. It was just sort of some kind of a recognition. But I followed sort of my passion toward politics, went to school at UC Santa Barbara, then was a labor organizer for 15 years, mostly a community organizer. When we started running our own union members for political office, everyday people, nurses, employment counselors, different things like that, I started to realize that I kind of had a knack. If I could help you be the CEO of your own organization, not speeches and stuff like that, but just learn how to build an organization to win, then I think you could succeed in your race. And that's sort of what sort of propelled me into politics.
There you go, everybody. So there's the first playbook of the day. So Henry, we're going to talk. We told people ahead of time when they're showing up, they know we're going to talk about change. And I know that there's a lot of things that you would say is different, that are different in the world about change. And I'll get there. But first, I'd like you to just to maybe talk about some principles of change, or maybe some things that haven't changed about change. Like, what's the same about change? Like, as we look at it today in 2021, I know we'll get to what we think is maybe different or changing, but what's static? What is it about how change happens organizationally, individually, that are the principles that don't change?
Well, there's the principles that we're following that don't work anymore. So we've sort of passed forward this world of repetition now for many, many generations, going back to the early farm of the 1700s to, Ben Franklin's craft, to Abraham Lincoln's sort of, industrial entrepreneur, to Henry Ford's assembly line, to those madmen consultants of the 50s and 60s who helped us squeeze every last bit of repetition out of the world. And so we've been playing with that playbook now for generations. What's also, I think, probably static in some ways is our view of the world. We still see that world sort of progressing. Maybe we know change is happening and it's faster and faster, but I mean, there's nothing, new about that. Henry VIII was complaining about the speed of change in his time. What's changed now is that we live in a world, I call it the changemaker effect. We live in a world now where everybody is in the change game. We have rising individual agency. We have the tools at our fingertips that were once available to a few. So I have my printing press. I have, I can be a broadcaster in a moment. I can shop seamlessly. And then we have the democratization of leadership, and all of that. If you think about it, we've shifted to an everyone leading in every moment world. And if the changemaker effect is simply this: if everything you change changes everything, and everyone is doing it, you're no longer in that linear faster change. You're now in a world of explosive omnidirectional change, because we're all in the change game now.
Yeah. So you've got to my next question. You anticipated my next question, which was what's different. So say a little bit more about everything we change changes everything. Say a little bit more about that comment, because that went by pretty quickly. And let's unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah. So, look, for me, it was a discovery from my days in the campaign in headquarters back in 2008. We grew up traditionally siloed and hierarchical because he announced. And 6 weeks later, we opened up the doors to our headquarters for the first time. And, you fill this blank space with strangers, and everybody gets into their lanes. It's like building the airplane in mid-flight. One person gets the fuselage, somebody gets the cockpit, somebody else gets the wheels. Pretty soon you have a collection of silos, basically managed by a silo leader at the top of that system. And that was probably the best way for us to catch up to the change forces around us. As we move from one leader at a time, as we move further along in the campaign calendar, speed is happening faster, shorter runways to elections. You're always a sort of a moment away from a mistake away from a PR crisis. All the things that are going on in a campaign, problems begin to outrace solutions, and that one leader at a time system just doesn't work. So we opened up the organization so that everyone could step into their leadership. And when we did, what I found out was basically the physics of leadership, from one leader at a time to everyone leading in every moment, were completely flipped on their heads, on its head. So, for example, one person big, everyone else small at any moment, everyone stepping into their bigness. You have, on the one hand, teams arranged by job functions. In this new way of working, people worked across those old silos to collect people around problems and opportunities. So in the old game, for every problem, a department, in the new game, for every problem, a different team. information on a need to know basis. In the old game, everyone has to have all the information to act because everyone has to step into their bigness. Permission-based, trust-based, sort of exclusion, inclusion. Everything we know about leadership is completely flipped on its head. And when I came out into the world and I realized, after 5 years in the Obama bubble between the campaign and the White House, what I realized was that the world looked much more like that everyone leading in every moment model, more than that one leader at a time model that, frankly, I came into the organization with.
So you talk in the book, and we are talking with Henry DeCio about his new book, Changemaker Playbook. And in the book, you talk about this everyone leads system, which you've started to unpack a bit. I'd like to one of the things that you say in the book is that we sort of did it, and then later, looking back, I figured out what we did. So you've just described it as if it was planned, which it was not.
Right.
So talk to me a little, or talk to us a little bit about if I'm listening and I'm intrigued with what you just said, what could I do immediately, or what could I start to do as a middle manager, as a frontline manager or leader, to start to affect some of this kind of different approach to leadership?
Yeah, I love your question, because it's true. We didn't have a staff meeting one day and say, boy, we need to shift this up. We need to do something differently. First of all, in those early days, now remember, you got computers coming out of boxes and we're still getting our servers up. You've got, checks coming in the mail. We're still scrambling to get our bank accounts open. We don't have any kind of, we don't have an employee manual. We have no rules, no norms, no cultural history to guide us. So for us, there were three things that I think, three pieces of guidance we got from the candidate, from then Senator Obama, that I think were hugely important, that I think we can also pay attention to in our own work. He gave us sort of set a cultural norm for us through these three principles. One, build it from the bottom up. So that sort of begins now. You're starting to see the sort of the beginnings of everyone leading culture. The second is respect everyone. So now you have sympathy, you have empathy. You have empathy, and you have collaboration. Sort of the makings, the groundwork for that, and then the one that, of course, is the most famous, which is no drama. So now it's sort of, let's check our egos at the door and work for the overall good of the mission. And so I think one of the first things I tell managers is that we live in an everyone a changemaker world now. We're in this new world where everyone leads in every moment. You're going to have to build a culture to accommodate that, both for your employees, but also to be able to build an organization that can interact with this new changemaker universe more seamlessly. Because again, the old structures, mindsets, the old playbook won't work in this new world of everyone a changemaker.
So you just used a word that you got three guiding principles, if you will, from the senator at the time, Obama, and one of those was respect everyone. And then you quickly glanced past a word that you talk about. There's a whole chapter in the book about it, and it's this idea of empathy as a driver of change. And I want to talk about that because I think it's important, and I want to talk about it for all of you that are watching or listening. I want you to think about this. Doesn't matter where, we're going to continue to talk about this idea that everyone can and has a role to play in change. We're going to keep talking about that. But if you have that positional spot, I want you to listen to this conversation about empathy as a driver of change, because it does, I think, perhaps change the way you think about the whole process. So Henry, talk about this, unpack or talk more about this idea of empathy as a driver of change.
Yeah, well, so it is interesting. Look, in the old, again, we're in polar opposite systems here. In the old one leader at a time, siloed hierarchical system, you needed to have a skill that you could take inside four walls and just enough empathy to get along with the others that you're working with. This new game, which is a shift from siloed teamwork to more fluid, open, integrated teamwork across those old silos, This requires a very different way of working. So in the old game, again, 20/20 vision, point the way, have everyone else follow. In this new game, everyone has to be able to manage their leadership responsibly. They have to manage their change responsibly. And that also means that you have to know how your change is affecting the others around you and how their change is affecting you. So you're working in a much more integrated system where empathy is the foundational skill, because on the one hand, rules can't keep up with the pace of change. I saw this in my experience as everyone moves to an everyone leading in every moment environment. We just can't keep up. And then the other part of this is it's a highly interactive system. So it's very much based on trust in your neighbor, and also based on the ability to know that your change is going to work for the good of all.
So how do we, as an individual, now I'm not talking about this hierarchically now, I'm not talking about this with, my leadership hat on necessarily. How do I, as an individual change maker, to use your language, how do I gauge and make sure that and calibrate against the organizational objectives, the change that perhaps I'm trying to create?
So I think as a manager, what I found, if I'm just speaking about in a managerial context and not societal, these do play out similarly. But in a managerial context, it's very, very key to be able to show all, have everybody be very clear about the objectives of the organization and the direction we're going. So having that sort of true north for the organization is very important for a manager. And it gives people then people have some sense of where we're going, and you can kind of play within not hard lines, but within sort of some boundaries. It's sort of like playing basketball. You can't let the ball go out of bounds, but you're going to do a lot of work inside together to innovate to get to that hoop. And so the very same thing is at play here. But again, you've got to have whole different systems for this. You've got to be able to have much more open systems of transparency, tools that allow more interactive communication. You have to be able to have 360 feedback, to your point about how you know if you're on point, because the community, when everyone is a leader, everyone is a stakeholder. And when everyone is a stakeholder, everyone is a steward. So the community is also managing itself toward its objectives.
So you mentioned that 360 feedback can be a tool in that process. Give us another example of a tool that people can use if they're trying to create this vision or this approach to making work happen, making change happen.
Well, so for me, in the campaign context, again, I would have a standing meeting with all the team every day. I had about 150 people that reported to me. We had, it was a 20-minute meeting. Not everyone spoke, but the idea was to get all the information out, not to debate it in that meeting, but to have everybody understand exactly where the different pieces of work were in the different functions, and then have people then collaborate across those boundaries and figure out, like, how can I help advance your mission? How can you help advance mine? So in the old way of working, it would be that sort of the senior leaders would come together. We'd sort of build the plan for the day. You'd take it back to your silo, get everybody on point, and you do this again in the morning. As the organization shifted toward everyone leading in every moment, what you had instead was we were curating that in that meeting. What's happening? How do we know what everyone is doing? Make sure that we're capitalizing on the opportunities to capitalize on. And that's how I ran my meetings too. So people would come together, figure out how to work together, go forward, and then we'd come back the next day and revisit that.
All right, awesome. So you talked in the book about it. A critical juncture, something that happened. And that is, so you've sort of painted this picture for us from, we have an announcement, we build a team, we open an office, and all this stuff is happening. And not all planned. It's just sort of how it was created in a natural way over time. So then we started to get, my words now, we started to get a little bit settled about how things are working. And suddenly, now we're the only candidate. Suddenly, Hillary Clinton is no longer in, and it's just your candidate, only one, heading toward the finish line. And you talked about how everyone started to get down, in my words again, into their own weeds, and we started to maybe almost start to build those silos. And so the phrase that I was thinking of as I was reading this was, you talked about, I've got to get everyone to see the bigger picture. So how did you help, or what advice would you have for people about raising the sights of the team so that they still saw where we're really headed? So in other words, everything you've just said sounds pretty good, sounds complex, sounds pretty good. And at some level, we've probably been on a project that was kind of like that. And then things started to settle down. And then we started to build systems and all of those things. How do you raise the sights of the team back? How do you keep us moving in that direction? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great catch there. That point you're talking about is about 16 months, about 16 months into the campaign. There are two realities. One reality is that we were successful for our innovation. Now, I'm not talking about the technological innovation, which is what people give us credit for. It was the ability in this new fluid open system for, particularly in the lower middle rungs of the organization, for people to work across those old silos and collect talent, around challenges and opportunities, not job titles and job descriptions, but, we knew each other. If people knew each other informally, and then they could actually recruit based on the opportunity of the moment. But there's another, there's a thing. Innovation is really about the ability to tear down walls between two or more sides that wouldn't otherwise connect, because that's when real innovation happens. And that was something we did continually through the campaign, but it's not necessarily something you notice. What you did notice was that person executed on a functional job. And then what happened is that while we were doing big things, we were being known for our ability to deliver on those small things, which is also important. And then what happened was people began to get defined by those small things. So I had a team, people called the travel bookers. The travel bookers were probably the most innovative people in the organization. And what they would do is, if you booked travel, among the other things they did, you had to have a conversation with them about options to make it sort of for cost and different other things. Well, the bottom line was they didn't tell you what to do differently. They just educated you on other options. And in that process, they gave me a report that showed that they had saved the campaign over 16 months enough money through their leadership interventions. So they measured this in dollars and cents. They'd saved us enough money to run a small state on. So the travel bookers were not really travel bookers. These were people who were responsible, young people who were responsible for the frugality, for our spending, frugal spending culture. They were responsible for good habits in the organization. They were essentially assistant CFOs, but they were known differently. So I just went around the organization and showed how people showed that other side of their reality in small meetings with different groups across the organization.
Perfect. And help people see that, because as you said, what starts to happen is we start to settle in, and you don't want, if we have to deal with explosive growth, to use the subtitle of the book, The New Physics of Leadership in a World of Explosive Change. If we're going to live in that world, then we have to continue to keep things fluid enough that allow us to have that be successful. So I think that's great. So the word that you keep using, and have used throughout, is the word change maker. We've certainly talked about leadership, but we've used the word change maker. And so my question for you is this: how can anyone in an organization, regardless of what kind of organization that they're in, how can anyone become a change maker?
Yeah.
Give us a couple of pieces of advice for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I didn't have that word during the campaign. I did use the term hope and change maker, more in a different context. That was a word that I got to know as I stepped out of my White House bubble and got back into the world. I started working with the world's leading social entrepreneurs through an organization called Ashoka Innovators for the Public. And as I worked side by side with these really high functioning change makers, what I saw was that they actually leaned into this other side. Remember, we just said there's two sides of the equation, sort of the small, being as small as the details of our work, and also doing remarkable things as change makers, but not really seeing that. So basically, change maker, if I would have described it at the time, I would have described it as something that existed in our organization, but also in the electorate, in the people we were interacting with. And this is not a partisan thing. This was throughout the electorate. Innovative mind, service heart, entrepreneurial spirit, and collaborative outlook.
Okay, so hold on, time out. Say those 4 things again.
Sure.
Because some people are on their treadmill right now, or they didn't have their pen in their hand. So say those 4 things again.
Absolutely. It's innovative mind, service heart, entrepreneurial spirit, and collaborative outlook. It's the new DNA. It's wherever I go, it doesn't matter. Any group I speak to, I say, now, how many of you are that? Every single hand goes up. Rare is the time I would not see a hand go up. So we self-identify into that now, but that is not what we see in the world, right? And so I think the key here is, it's not how do you become a change maker, it's that you are a change maker. I think this word gives us an identity that we can all relate to, particularly behind that definition. Now the question is, are you building an organization that can accommodate change makers? Are you still building that sort of one leader at a time, siloed hierarchical system? Because I will tell you, the change maker working in that system, it's like caging a tiger. It just doesn't work.
I want to shift gears. I'm going to shift 2 gears between now and when we're done, Henry. And the first one that I want to shift to is, we've been talking a lot about the campaign, but you started by saying I ended up working in the White House. So most of us that are watching or listening have not done that. And so the question is, give us one lesson that you learned working in the White House. It doesn't have to be about the book if you don't want it to be, but what's something that you learned working at the White House?
Well, look, in the book, I give the example of Michelle Obama as a change maker. So I hope people will spend some time with that section, but maybe just to step out of the book for a minute. It was, again, if you're a change maker, you've got to be able to move in your own context with this sort of new leadership idea. One of the things that was interesting, I recognized in the very early days of the White House, was that the people I really relied on in the campaign were the ones who could get the job done no matter when. So that meant if there was there's a fire at 2 a.m, you've got to have somebody answer that call, and I've got to know about it. So we were our own system. When we came into the White House, our system our team of teams also includes the career people who are not working at 2 a.m. They're very dedicated, but they have different kinds of hours. We have a little bit different structure. And so I actually found that if my folks were not organizing themselves into that period of time, didn't mean you were going to do work, later in the day, in the evening. But the bottom line was, you've got to be able to work with people when they're available to do that. So it became less the most available and then the most organized. And not everybody could make that transition. So I'd be saying to people, like, if you're still here at 11 o'clock at night, you're not impressing me now. That was impressive in the campaign, but you've got to work very differently in this new environment. So that was one of the biggest discoveries for me. And it really came very early. That's
awesome. And what I love about it most is that once it was clear to you as a leader, you shared that. Hey, that's not helping. My expectation is not the same as it was before, because the world has now changed. The situation in which we find ourselves, our context is now different. That's an awesome place to land that section of where we're at. Henry, a couple things about you before we go. What is it that you do, sir, for fun? What does Henry do for fun?
Well, one of the things I do that a lot of people don't know about is I take a sabbatical every 7 years. I don't ever plan for this, so it's not funded, which is a problem. But for about 6 months, every 7 years, I take time off. So this last sabbatical, because I was traveling, as you said earlier, global ambassador for changemakers, I was logging like the miles of a Secretary of State, in my previous life working with leading social entrepreneurs. So I took time off. I taught at American University. I taught a class at American University, helping young change makers with their both with their internships in the community and then classroom learning in my class. I coached my kids' Little League team. I played a lot more tennis than I have for a while. So it was really just kind of getting to do the things at home that I couldn't do for a long time. Oh, and I wrote this book. So I took some time to learn, but learning how to, again, I've done a book before, but learning how to it's a learning process in a new environment, how to write it, how to market it, how to get it to launch. It's different than it was 7 years ago when I did the last book.
It's very true. So speaking of books, Henry, what's something that you've read recently or that you're reading now?
So I've been very busy with when I'm writing my book, I don't read other things because I'm trying to stay focused on what I'm doing with the interviews. But I do read to my kids, and I read my wife and I both read to our kids. Our kids are 13 and 12, one about to turn 12. And so I have actually been reading with them because I found it was a little too much for them on their own. I've been reading my first book about the Obama campaign. They weren't born yet, so they didn't know our life back then. Dante was born and turned 1 in the campaign, but Zane was born during the White House years. So I've been reading Campaign Inc. to them, which has been fun. And then also I've read Rich Dad, Poor Dad to them because I want them to understand. I want them to have a financial sense. I find that's a very easy book for young people, and I find it very useful for me as well. I like leadership books. I like Covey. Those kinds of books are the things that I like to read. But there's a lot of things in society going on right now, and I'm really wanting to check into some of the reading around that too.
Awesome. So before we go, where do you want to point people? How can people get to know more about you, connect with you, learn more about the book, etc.?
If you so changemakerplaybook.com is where all the information about the book is. And if you want to download a sample chapter there, you can go and do that if you want to just dip your toe in the water.
It's a good place to start, and you can get all the links to where you can actually get the book any place that you can find where you find books. You'll be able to find a copy of Changemaker Playbook, The New Physics of Leadership in a World of Explosive Change with Henry DeCio. And so now my question for all of you before we go, the question for all of you who are watching and listening, and that is, now what? What are you going to do? What action are you going to take? Are you going to think more about those 4 criteria or those 4 definitional ideas for change makers? Are you going to think about what are you doing intentionally or not that might or might not be helping your team be better equipped for a new level and speed of change? What is it that you will take from today to take action on? Because hopefully you found this enjoyable, and hopefully you found Henry to be brilliant, which he is. But most of all, what we both hope that you do is take some action, because if you don't take any action, it really didn't do any of us or the world around us any good. So we hope that you will do that. And we hope that you'll for sure do that. And we hope that you'll be back next week for another episode right here, every week live, and every week a new episode, a new conversation on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I hope you'll be back next week because I'll be here. I hope you will be too. We'll see you then, everybody, next week on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks.